Picture this. It's March 2020. The world is locking down. Stock markets are in free fall. Governments are scrambling. And suddenly, everyone, from Tokyo to London to Sao Paulo, is doing the same thing. They're buying dollars, not their own currency, not gold, dollars, American dollars. In the middle of a global pandemic that hit America as hard as anywhere else, the entire planet ran to the US currency like it was the only life raft in the ocean. Why? Or think about this. When Russia invaded Ukraine in 2022, the West's most powerful weapon wasn't tanks or missiles. It was cutting Russia off from the dollar system. Overnight, hundreds of billions in Russian assets were frozen, not because America owned them, but because they couldn't function without access to American financial infrastructure. Here's the strange part. America didn't conquer the global financial system. It didn't demand this role. There was no treaty signed, no empire claimed. The United States became the world's banker almost by accident. This is the story of how that happened. How a country that was a debtor nation just over a century ago became the place where the world parks its money, prices its oil, and settles its debts. How wars, crises, and a series of decisions that seemed logical at the time created a financial architecture that now shapes everything from your grocery prices to whether entire countries can survive sanctions. And here's the twist. Nobody planned it this way. Not really. So how does a country become the central bank of planet Earth without meaning to? Let's find out. To understand how America ended up running global finance, we need to go back to a world where it absolutely didn't. For most of modern history, the job belonged to Britain. In the 1800s, London was the unquestioned center of global finance. The British pound was the currency that mattered. If you were a government in Argentina needing to borrow money, you went to London. If you were a merchant in Shanghai buying tea, you probably settled the deal in pounds. The British Empire's vast network of trade, colonies, and naval power made the pound sterling the closest thing to a global currency the world had ever seen. But why did the world need a financial center at all? Think of international finance like a massive game of telephone, except with money. Country A wants to trade with Country B, but they use different currencies. They need someone trusted to facilitate the exchange, to hold reserves, to extend credit when shipments are in transit. Without a central hub, every transaction becomes exponentially more complicated. The gold standard made this easier. Most major currencies were pegged to gold at fixed rates. If you knew how many pounds bought an ounce of gold and how many francs bought an ounce of gold, you could figure out the pound-franc exchange rate. Simple enough. But even under gold, you needed deep liquid markets. You needed banks with global reach. You needed a legal system people trusted. You needed, essentially, a banker, someone who could clear transactions, hold reserves, and keep the whole system running. Britain had all of this. The City of London was to 19th century finance what Silicon Valley is to tech today. It had the capital, the expertise, and the trust built over decades of being the world's dominant trading power. And then came 1914. When World War I broke out, nobody thought it would reshape global finance. But wars are expensive. Catastrophically expensive. Britain and France were fighting an industrialized conflict on a scale humanity had never seen. Artillery shells, tanks, millions of men in trenches. All of it had to be paid for. And pretty quickly, Europe started running out of money. Enter America. In 1914, the United States was actually a debtor nation. American railroads and industries had been built largely with European capital. We owed them money, but the US had something Europe desperately needed. Industrial capacity that wasn't being shelled by German artillery. American factories could produce steel, grain, weapons, fuel. Britain and France needed all of it, but they couldn't pay in gold forever. They needed credit. Loans, big ones. Wall Street stepped in. J.P. Morgan and other American banks began extending massive loans to the Allies, billions of dollars. By the time the war ended, the financial relationship had completely reversed. Europe owed America. The United States went from debtor to creditor in just 4 years. And here's the key thing. This wasn't a grand strategy. American bankers weren't thinking, let's become the center of global finance. They were thinking, there's profit to be made here, and Britain is probably going to win. But the effect was irreversible. After the war, Europe was broke. The British pound, which had been backed by gold and confidence, was now backed by debt and exhaustion. London was still important, but it was no longer unshakable. Meanwhile, New York had money, lots of it. Gold flowed into U.S. vaults. American banks had proven they could handle enormous international transactions. Wall Street had, almost by accident, become a serious rival to the City of London. The world didn't switch overnight. Britain still mattered. The pound still mattered. But a crack had formed in the old order. And cracks, once they start, tend to spread. If World War I cracked the old system, the Great Depression shattered it. The 1929 crash and the depression that followed revealed something terrifying. Nobody actually knew how to run a modern financial system. Banks failed by the thousands. Countries abandoned the gold standard, then went back to it, then abandoned it again. Tariffs went up. Trade collapsed. Currencies became weapons in a desperate scramble for advantage. It was financial chaos. Britain tried to maintain its role as a global financial center, but it simply didn't have the resources anymore. The pound faced crisis after crisis. In 1931, Britain finally gave up on the gold standard entirely, an unthinkable move just years earlier. For the United States, the Depression was a brutal education. The Federal Reserve, which had been created in 1913, made catastrophic mistakes. It let the money supply collapse. It stood by as banks failed. Historians still debate exactly what the Fed should have done differently, but everyone agrees it screwed up. But institutions learn, sometimes painfully. In the 1930s, America built new financial architecture: the Securities and Exchange Commission to regulate markets, the FDIC to ensure bank deposits, new rules about banking, credit, and disclosure. The Fed itself became more active, more willing to intervene. The lesson Americans learned eventually was that financial stability isn't automatic. Markets don't self-regulate into perfect equilibrium. Sometimes you need a lender of last resort, sometimes you need rules. This mattered because when the next crisis came, and there would be a next crisis, the United States would be far better prepared than anyone else. That crisis, of course, was World War II. By 1944, the outcome of World War II was no longer in doubt. The Allies were going to win. But the people planning for peace had learned from last time. After World War I, the victors had made a mess of things: punitive reparations, economic chaos, unstable currencies. Many believed those mistakes had helped cause World War II. They were determined not to repeat them. So in July 1944, delegates from 44 countries gathered at a resort in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. Their mission: design a new international monetary system. The key figures were John Maynard Keynes, representing Britain, and Harry Dexter White, representing the United States. Both were brilliant economists. Both wanted stability, but they had very different visions. Keynes proposed an entirely new international currency. He called it the Bancor, that would be managed by a global institution. No single country would dominate. It was elegant, idealistic, and had absolutely no chance of happening. White's plan was simpler: make the dollar the anchor. Here's how it worked. Every country would peg its currency to the dollar at a fixed rate. The dollar, in turn, would be pegged to gold at $35 per ounce. If you had dollars, you could, in theory, exchange them for gold. Other countries couldn't, but they could exchange their currency for dollars, which was almost as good. The US would hold most of the world's gold reserves. Everyone else would hold dollars. Why did the world agree to this? Because America had the gold. Because it had the only major industrial economy that hadn't been bombed to rubble. Because it was clear that New York, not London, was now the deepest, most liquid financial market on Earth. Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt, had no choice but to agree. But here's what's crucial. The Americans didn't see this as permanent. They thought Bretton Woods was a temporary fix, a way to stabilize things until Europe and Asia recovered. Once everyone was back on their feet, the system would become more balanced. Other currencies would strengthen. The dollar's dominance would fade. That's not what happened. For about 25 years, Bretton Woods worked, sort of. Currencies were stable, trade grew, Europe and Japan rebuilt, the global economy boomed. But there was a problem, a big one. The system required the US to maintain enough gold reserves to theoretically back all the dollars circulating in the world. But as global trade expanded, more and more dollars were needed, and the US gold supply wasn't growing fast enough. By the 1960s, the math stopped working. European central banks started to notice. France, under Charles de Gaulle, began converting dollars to gold, essentially calling America's bluff. De Gaulle called this system an exorbitant privilege for the United States. And he was right. By 1971, the United States faced a choice: raise interest rates dramatically to defend the dollar, crashing the domestic economy in the process, or break the link to gold. On August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon went on television and announced that the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. The Bretton Woods system was over. Economists predicted chaos. How could a currency have value if it wasn't backed by gold? Why would anyone trust the dollar now? And yet, the dollar didn't collapse. In fact, it remained the world's dominant currency. Why? Because by 1971, the infrastructure was already in place. Global trade was priced in dollars. Central banks held dollar reserves. Oil was sold in dollars. Companies borrowed in dollars. Replacing all of that would require massive coordination, and there was no obvious alternative. The British pound was a shadow of its former self. The German mark and Japanese yen were strong, but their economies were much smaller than America's. The Soviet ruble was a joke outside the communist bloc, so the world kept using dollars. Not because they had to, legally, but because it was easier than switching. This is where trust becomes more important than gold. Markets trusted the U.S. Federal Reserve to manage the dollar responsibly. They trusted American institutions, courts, property rights, the rule of law. They trusted that the U.S. economy was big and dynamic enough that dollar-denominated assets would hold value. Trust, it turned out, was a better foundation than metal. The dollar had gone from a gold-backed currency to a fiat currency, backed by nothing but faith in American institutions. And the world accepted it. So what does it actually mean that America is the world's banker? It means three things. First, U.S. Treasury bonds are the world's savings account. When China runs a trade surplus, where does it put the money? Treasuries. When Saudi Arabia sells oil, where does it park the proceeds? Treasuries. When a pension fund in Germany wants a safe asset, what does it buy? Treasuries. U.S. government debt is considered the safest asset on earth. Safer than gold because you can't earn interest on gold sitting in a vault. Treasuries pay interest, are easy to trade, and are backed by the largest economy in the world. This gives the U.S. government an incredible advantage. It can borrow cheaply, very cheaply. Even when deficits balloon, investors keep buying treasuries because there's nowhere else is safe to put trillions of dollars. Second, Wall Street is the planet's capital allocator. If you're a company in Brazil, India, or South Korea and you want to raise serious money, you often do it through New York. American investment banks, asset managers, and markets set the terms for global capital flows. This isn't just about stocks and bonds, it's about private equity, venture capital, derivatives, commodities. The language of global finance is English. The standards are American. The legal frameworks are often American or modeled on American law. Third, the Federal Reserve is a de facto global central bank. When the Fed raises interest rates, it affects borrowing costs in Thailand. When the Fed cuts rates, it influences investment decisions in Turkey. During the 2008 financial crisis, and again in 2020, the Fed opened currency swap lines with foreign central banks, basically becoming the lender of last resort not just for America, but for the world. The Fed doesn't officially have a global mandate. Its job is to manage the U.S. economy, but in practice, its decisions ripple across every market on the planet. None of this was designed. There was no meeting where officials said, let's make treasuries the world's safe asset. It emerged organically because the alternatives were worse. But emergent systems have consequences, and not all of them are good. Being the world's banker isn't free. It comes with costs, many of which weren't obvious at first. Let's start with the most visible one, persistent trade deficits. If the world wants to hold dollars, the U.S. has to supply them. The main way that happens is through trade. When America imports more than it exports, dollars flow out into the global economy. Those dollars come back as investments in treasuries and U.S. assets, but the trade deficit itself becomes structural. In the 1950s and 60s, this was manageable, but over decades, it contributed to deindustrialization. Why make steel in Pennsylvania when you can import it cheaply and the dollars just flow back into financial markets? Why compete in manufacturing when the financial sector offers higher returns? The American economy shifted. Factories closed. Rust Belt cities hollowed out. The country got very good at finance and technology, but lost ground in industries that once defined middle-class prosperity. Second trade-off, financialization. When you're the world's financial hub, finance becomes a disproportionately large part of your economy. That can be lucrative. Wall Street generates enormous wealth, but it also means more resources. Talent, capital, political influence flow into financial engineering rather than physical engineering. And financial systems are fragile. The bigger they get, the more dangerous their collapse is. The 2008 crisis started in American housing markets but metastasized globally precisely because the world was so financially interconnected through dollar-based markets. Third trade-off, asset bubbles. When global savings flood into U.S. markets, they push up asset prices. Stocks get expensive. Real estate gets expensive. This makes existing asset holders richer, but it makes it harder for new entrants to build wealth. And when those bubbles pop, the damage is enormous, both domestically and globally. Fourth trade-off, moral hazard and dependency. The rest of the world knows that if the dollar system breaks, everyone suffers. So they have an incentive to keep supporting it, even when they resent it. But that creates a kind of moral hazard. The U.S. can run enormous deficits, knowing that foreign investors will keep buying treasuries. Politicians can avoid hard fiscal choices because borrowing is cheap. Meanwhile, other countries become dependent on dollar stability. Emerging markets borrow in dollars because it's cheaper. But if the dollar strengthens suddenly, their debt burdens explode. Currency crises in Asia, Latin America, and elsewhere have often been triggered by shifts in U.S. monetary policy. The system creates fragility it was supposed to prevent. And here's the deepest irony. America didn't want most of these trade-offs. They're the unintended consequences of a role it gradually assumed. But there's another side to financial dominance. Power. Real geopolitical power. The U.S. doesn't just manage the world's money, it controls access to it. Take sanctions. When the U.S. decides to sanction a country, Iran, North Korea, Russia, it doesn't just stop Americans from doing business there. It can cut that country off from the entire dollar-based financial system. How? Because even transactions between two non-American parties often pass through U.S. banks, use dollar clearing systems, or rely on the SWIFT network, which the U.S. has enormous influence over. If you're a European company selling machinery to Iran and the transaction involves dollars at any point, the U.S. can freeze it. Your bank, terrified of losing access to American markets, will comply. This is an astonishing form of leverage. It's financial coercion without military force. And it works. Sanctions have crippled Iran's economy, devastated Venezuela, and isolated North Korea. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the West didn't just impose tariffs or embargoes. It froze Russian central bank reserves held in dollars and euros, hundreds of billions made inaccessible overnight. That's power. But it's also creating a backlash. Countries that aren't even adversaries of the U.S. are watching nervously. If America can freeze Russia's reserves, what's stopping it from freezing anyone's? If the dollar system can be weaponized, maybe it's dangerous to be so dependent on it. China, Russia, and others have started working on alternatives. Yuan-based trade deals, national payment systems, digital currencies. None of these are remotely close to replacing the dollar yet. But the intent is clear. Reduce exposure to a system they no longer fully trust. The U.S. finds itself in a strange position. It has financial power it never explicitly sought. And now, using that power is undermining the very trust that created it in the first place. Nobody planned this. The dollar became a tool of foreign policy because it could be, not because anyone sat down in 1944 and said, let's build a system that lets us sanction countries half a century from now. Power without intention is a dangerous thing, because you inherit all the responsibilities but none of the design. So the obvious question, is dollar dominance ending? It's a question people have been asking for decades, and the answer keeps being not yet, but the challenges are real. China is the most obvious threat. It's the world's second largest economy, the largest trading nation, and it desperately wants to internationalize the yuan. Beijing has set up currency swap agreements, launched the Belt and Road Initiative to expand yuan use, and created its own payment systems to bypass SWIFT. In 2022, it even started settling some oil trades in yuan. But the yuan has a fundamental problem: capital controls. China doesn't allow its currency to freely flow in and out of the country. You can't just buy yuan and invest anywhere you want. The Chinese government tightly manages exchange rates and capital flows. That's a deal breaker for reserve currency status. Central banks and investors want liquidity. They want to be able to move money freely. Without that, the yuan will struggle to compete with the dollar. Then there's the euro. On paper, the eurozone is massive, comparable to the US economy, but it's fragmented. 19 countries, 19 debt markets, no unified fiscal policy. When crisis hits, there's no single European treasury to backstop the system. The euro is important. It's the second most used reserve currency. But it's not replacing the dollar. What about digital currencies? Bitcoin, central bank digital currencies, stablecoins? These are interesting, and they'll matter. But replacing the dollar requires more than technology. It requires trust, legal infrastructure, deep markets, and a government stable enough to back it all. Bitcoin is too volatile. Central bank digital currencies are too new and uncertain. Stablecoins are mostly pegged to the dollar. The real challenge isn't finding an alternative, it's the inertia problem. Switching away from the dollar isn't like switching phones. It's like rebuilding the entire telecommunications network while everyone's still making calls. Every contract written in dollars, every reserve held in treasuries, every company with dollar debt, all of that creates momentum. Switching costs are enormous. Coordination is nearly impossible. So the dollar persists. Not because it's perfect, not because everyone loves America, but because the alternatives are worse, the switching costs are prohibitive, and the infrastructure is already in place. That said, fragmentation is possible. We might not see the yuan or euro replace the dollar, but we could see a more multipolar system, regional currencies for regional trade, less dependence on any single hub, more alternatives at the margins. It wouldn't be a clean transition. It would be messy, slow, and probably punctuated by crises. But that's how these things tend to happen, not with a bang, but with a long, grinding shift. So let's come back to where we started. Why does the world run to America when money panics? Not because America conquered global finance, not because there was a master plan, but because a series of historical accidents, wars, crises, decisions that made sense at the time, gradually built a system where the dollar became indispensable. World War I made America a creditor. The Great Depression taught it how to manage financial systems. World War II left it with most of the world's gold. Bretton Woods formalized the arrangement. The 1971 shock should have ended it, but trust and inertia kept it going. And now, more than half a century later, the United States is stuck with a role it never explicitly chose. It gets cheap borrowing and enormous geopolitical leverage, but it also gets deindustrialization, asset bubbles, and the responsibility of being the world's lender of last resort. It has power, but that power increasingly alienates the very countries that make the system work. The dollar's dominance isn't eternal, nothing in history is, but it also won't end quickly or cleanly. These systems have momentum. They're built on trillions of contracts, decades of habit, and the simple fact that changing everything is harder than changing nothing. America became the world's banker without meaning to, and now it has to live with what that means. Whether it can manage that responsibility, whether anyone could, is one of the great questions of our time. The dollar didn't conquer the world. The world just ran out of better options. And that's a very different kind of power. If this video made you think, do me a favor, hit the like button. And subscribe to Histonom because I dive deep into topics like this on this channel.